All right, so I think we'll just go ahead and get started. I think this is pretty much everybody who had signed up for today. So thanks for coming, everybody. I know a lot of you, but for those of you I don't know, I'm Tony Aiello. I'm Associate Director of Collections. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about climate resilience and some of the planning we're doing to look at the collections, sort of look at it long term. So just as a little background, I think we all know, a lot about Longwood. Obviously, we know the plants here, we know the displays, and I think for the visitor who comes here, they see Longwood in many different ways. But for a lot of visitors who come here, they really come for the shows, both inside and outside. They really come to see what we're putting out there, putting forward in front of everybody. And I think what's less known about Longwood is that we do have plant collections. And we have really significant collections, and we manage these collections in a way that works like many other and all other botanic gardens. And so the most obvious ones, I think, are things like the orchid collection, the mum collection, but there are others sort of go on behind the scenes. And so when we talk about museums and museum collections, how do you define what a collection is? And it's really defined as a material or intangible objects which an individual or an establishment has assembled, classified, etc., in a safe setting and displays to an audience. So that's sort of one definition of what collections are. And so I think to a lot of people, when they think about museum collections, they think about objects, sort of objects rather than living collections, whether it's painting, sculpture, furniture. I think that's what comes to mind to people when you mention museum collections, and not so much botanic gardens. So I think that's something that we need to continue to educate people about and continue to promote as part of what, as a significant part of what Longwood is. And so collections are really what make museums unique. They're more than objects. It's really about the assemblage and the process of curation. And it's really about the curatorial expertise and the fact that curators have a very distinctive way of understanding our objects, sort of being didactic or making arguments with them and telling stories with them. So I think that's what really is essential to museum collections, and specifically in our case to living collections. So hopefully you all know that we do have a living plant collections policy which guides how we assemble plants here, what the direction is for our plants here. And this policy provides a framework for management and day-to-day activities related to the living collection. So it's really a strategy for curatorial goals, for acquisitions, for development, and for documentation. So it really sets the broad picture. And then for our major collections, we have management plans which go into a lot more detail about what we are assembling. And so, some of the most significant collections here are Pierce's Park, which is really a collection of time, not so much a taxonomic collection, the Magnolia collection, and orchids and others, as I've mentioned. So what I want to talk about today, though, is how we're sort of forward-looking with the collections and how we're looking forward with developing these collections in the face of climate change. So there's lots of ways, there's lots of models out there, there's lots of ways to think about climate changing. On the left is a image of predicted temperature change, and this is looking at on the top two images, high emissions scenario and mid emissions scenario. Regardless, what we're facing is overall temperature change, increasing temperature, and as you know, it seems like each year is the hottest year on record for the last several years. And then in conjunction with that, the image on the right really looks at precipitation. And precipitation, both of these are complicated. Precipitation is maybe a little more complicated. And so for our part of the world, what we're looking at are warmer and wetter winters, and then warmer and drier summers. And so those things, all those factors combined to start to think about what kinds of plants can we grow here moving forward. And so people have also modeled the hardiness zone map. So this is the USDA hardiness zone map. This is a little hard to read, but I'm happy to share the links with you. And essentially, over the next, let's just say, next 15 years, looking at moderate and high scenarios, we're really going from what historically has been zone 6. So in my lifetime, I've actually seen changes from, sort of warmer, almost warmer zone 5 to zone 6. We're now in zone 7, and if these predictions are right, within the next 15 years, which is a very tangible amount of time, we're predicted to be in the warmest parts of zone 7 and maybe even in zone 8. So, if you think about planting a tree today, that tree is going to be growing under much different conditions, even within a 15-year span. And so within my sort of horticultural lifetime, I was in school in the early 80s. It's really two zones of change, two hardiness zones of change, which is really drastic. So that's sort of going from the northern parts of Philadelphia to being in Savannah or South Carolina. So that's, if you think about it in that terms, it really hits home. And as horticulturists, I think that's a really good way to think about it, is what will we be able to grow, or what will we be growing in 15 years or so? So looking back, as horticulturists, people who've worked at Longwood have always been interested in kind of pushing the envelope. So there are two old southern magnolias in the hillside garden and one opposite on Frog Hollow. Going back through the records, these were first purchased by Pierre DuPont in 1929, and the invoices say for experimental purposes. So they were thinking about trying these out because southern magnolia traditionally was not very successful here in Philadelphia. And the invoice has a carload of magnolias from North Carolina. And this isn't someone's station wagon. This was a boxcar load. So this is what Pierre would have bought. And I think there were maybe 20 to 25 trees in that boxcar. If you look at the old maps, there were a lot more on the hillside. And then with cold winters, there were some cold winters in the early 60s, some cold winters in the late 70s, early 80s. You see this sort of attrition of trees on the hillside, and then we're left with these three trees that have sort of this has been a 100-year experiment. So as far as I know, these are the oldest documented southern magnolias in Philadelphia, or in the Philadelphia area. They were planted about 100 years ago. I'm guessing they were about 20 years old when we received them. So they're probably about 120 years old, or give or take a little bit. Some other lessons we can learn are plants that have sort of the reverse of this, is the plants that have really done well here over time that are starting to suffer from whether it's disease pressure or combined disease and climate pressures. When we look at cedar of Lebanon and Atlas cedar, we see a lot of diseases and a lot of other issues with the big old trees here. And then conversely, we can look at what we have in the collection and look at plants that have done well. So there's a lot of variation within these species. So if we can look at those species, Cedrus atlantica, for instance, and find ones that are doing better, then maybe we focus our efforts on propagating those. Similarly, there's a deodar cedar up in the golf course behind the carriage shed. This was grown from seed collected in Pakistan in the early 1950s. There were more of them planted there, and over time there's been this one survivor. So deodar cedar is a plant, again, I feel old saying this, but within my lifetime, it was sort of a marginal plant. And if you were learning about cedars in the early 80s, it was something that, there were a couple cultivars that might work. Now it seems much more common, and so it's really a good indicator of climate change. This tree has certainly withstood the test of time, and so it's certainly be worth propagating it and using it as maybe a cedar for the future here, or going and trying to collect additional plants from the range of deodar cedar. So this process is ongoing. It's not like we don't think about this, and so there are examples of climate resilient plants that we've been adding to the gardens. On the left is a live oak, and we have 5 live oaks planted throughout the gardens. In the center are two ashes that came from China, Fraxus insularis and Fraxinus stylosa, which are thought to be resistant to emerald ash borer. And then on the right is one of the National Arboretum hybrid hemlocks, which is resistant to hemlock woolly adelgid. So these are all plants that have potential for either heat tolerance or disease or insect resistance moving forward. So I want to talk a little bit about the live oak process because these are obviously these are trees and they take a long time to grow and they take a long time to evaluate. So this is really, in many ways, a generational process that takes a lot of time to really see how these plants will perform for us. So if you go up and poke around up on Oak Knoll, there are 3 live oaks planted there from this project that I started in 2012. So if you go to the south, you see these magnificent live oaks, and I've always wondered if we could grow them in the Delaware Valley. So in 2012, I traveled with a friend to Virginia to do some collecting. Here you can see the range of live oak. This is the complete native range within the United States. You can ignore Utah. The yellow counties are ones where within that state it's a listed or a rare plant. In Virginia, it occurs only in the tidewater area around Norfolk and Virginia Beach. This is the only place it occurs in the wild or naturally. So in 2012, Michael Dosman and I, Michael's from the Arnold Arboretum, traveled to Virginia and did this transect from Richmond to Williamsburg to Virginia Beach and collecting both cultivated and wild collecting from both cultivated and wild plants along the way. So we were 2 northern guys. Michael's from Indiana. I'm from Delco. We didn't know much about live oak, so it was a learning experience for both of us. But there were a couple of old trees in Richmond which had survived, fairly dramatic cold winters. So we collected from those. As I said, we were in Williamsburg and at College of William and Mary in Colonial Williamsburg, collecting trees there, which we believe to be sort of near wild, collected locally and planted at both of those places. And then we visited a natural population at First Landing State Park, which is in Virginia Beach. So as I said, we had this sort of transect of plants that we grew on. So that was in 2012. In the fall of 2016, while I was at the Morris Arboretum, we planted out a trial block of these. We had 12 different collections. We planted 3 of each in this trial. And then by the February of 2023, they looked like this. So within 7 years, they had really grown and matured. The Morris did a distribution of about 20 of these plants, 3 of which came here to Longwood. So they were dug in the spring. You can see them on the left being moved. On the right, here's our 3 trees at the nursery. These then got planted out in March of 23 here at Longwood. So on the left is Michael with one of our trees. That's when it had just been planted. And on the right, it was a slide taken in a year later, essentially, in the summer of this past summer. So they've really established and have really done well. So far, they're looking good here. They've also been planted at a number of different locations up and down the East Coast. So we're kind of doing this meta study, looking at how they're performing all the way from Boston to Washington, D.C. Here are 2 trees at West Laurel Hill Cemetery in suburban, just outside of Philadelphia in Bala. And then over the years, I was while I was at the Morris, giving plants to the University of Pennsylvania, which is probably a half a zone warmer than we are here or in Northwest Philadelphia. So it's a good test site for things. So the plants at Penn have really done well. There's one being used as a street tree right near University of Pennsylvania Hospital. So these have really, really succeeded well, and it's a definite microclimate down in West Philadelphia there. So that's kind of an ongoing study. We're looking, as I said, these things take a long time. So it's been 12 years since we collected those seed, and the trees have, so far have been done really, really well. So it'll be interesting to see the arc over time of how these perform. Kind of a little bit closer to home in the fall of 2020, Peter and I did some local collecting. We really couldn't travel because it was COVID, so we did some very, very local collecting, including in Lower Chester County, looking for Quercus falcata, which is the southern red oak. It's a plant that it really has a wide range throughout the southern United States, and it just gets up into Pennsylvania and New Jersey. So in Pennsylvania, it's in southern Chester County, in Nottingham Township. It does occur in Montgomery County and in Bucks County. So it's really just, the sort of southeastern parts of Pennsylvania. We collected seed as I said, in September of 2020. These are growing in our greenhouse. And often plant collecting is sort of prosaic. We basically just drove down a couple roads. Here we made 3 collection sites, all roadside collecting. There's near the Hers potato chip the Hers factory is up here. We're right near there, and then a couple other locations on either side of Route 1. So this is Route 1 just before it crosses into Maryland. Sometimes it's very easy just to drive down the road and there's your tree, and the acorns or seeds are really very accessible. I think that's Peter picking up acorns off the ground right there. So it doesn't always have to be, climbing a mountain in some far off place. You can find interesting plants literally in your backyard. And speaking of which, Pinus taeta, or loblolly pine, is a really great potential replacement for our eastern white pine. Again, you can see it has a broad southern range that just gets up into southern New Jersey and northern Delaware. So this was last year. This is the Costco in Christiana, and by the Costco gas station, these are sprinkled in this woods edge here is a whole population of Pinus taeta. So we're able to collect cones and seedlings from those. So it's, as far as we know, the northernmost source of loblolly pine. And so, this has a lot of potential for growing here. And these are little seedlings that we have currently have in Poly 7. So switching gears a little bit, I want to talk about something that's more horticultural and less talking about wild collecting trees. And so we all love and know the flowering cherry exhibit that we have here in the spring. But if you look at flowering cherries at this time of year, often they're completely defoliated, often by mid-September. And there's a fungal leaf spot disease that affects them, that basically defoliates them. This was a paper done at the National Arboretum looking at resistance to leaf spot across, I know you probably can't read this, across a wide range of cultivars and species of flowering cherry. The upshot of this is that Yoshino cherry tends to be one of the worst in terms of most susceptible to this leaf spot. This is in Oak Knoll. You can see early October of last year, right around early October. You can see lots of defoliated Yoshino cherries. There's a cultivar of Prunus cellulata ojochin, which is completely foliated. And then over by the carriage shed, where there's those very large old Yoshinos, there's some variation in leaf retention versus leaf loss. So it'll be interesting to see if that carries through. So from a horticultural point of view, it'd be nice to have a cherry with leaves and fall color in October and not a defoliated cherry. And then the other part of this is that a lot of flowering cherries are becoming invasive, particularly Prunus yadoensis, Yoshino, and Prunus subortella. This is in the woods by my house in Northwest Philadelphia, but if you drive anywhere in the spring, you see Prunus subortella or whatever that complex of flowering cherries is in full flower throughout, woodland edges, or sort of escaped in lots of places. And so I've started to look at fruit production on flowering cherries as well as leaf retention. Looks like pretty much all the Yoshinos produce fruit. So, if you have a plant that doesn't keep its leaves and has potential invasiveness, can we find an alternative to that? So this is, again, looking at climate changes and how we can find something that's better suited to our changing climate. So there's a plant that came out of the National Arboretum about 10 years ago, Prunus Helen Taft. It's a hybrid of Prunus jadauensis and Prunus campanulata. Campanulata is from Taiwan, has essentially no cold tolerance whatsoever for us, but has good heat tolerance. So this is, it's a plant that is kind of it grows a lot like Yoshino cherry. It's fast growing, has a darker pink flower, it's very floriferous, gets to be a fairly sizable tree. But if you look at it in October, it has leaves and it doesn't have any, well, if you look at it in June, it doesn't have any fruit. If you look at it in October, it has leaves and has fall color. So this is the kind of thing that I think we can start to move towards, is a plant that fills that niche, but really doesn't have or has the desirable traits that we're looking for. Okay, and then another way of attacking this is looking at things like Prunus higurashi. This is perhaps my favorite flowering cherry. This is in the corner of the parking lot by the slow gate. It's really a remarkable tree. Because it has double flowers, it doesn't produce fruit, and so we can look at some of these other traits that might be beneficial to avoid the invasiveness issue. So what does this mean for us at Longwood? So we're really looking at planning and thinking about the next 20, 30, 40 years and beyond. And this is an image from the Climate Change Alliance of Botanic Gardens. And really, it really encapsulates what goes into the planning and implementation when you're starting to look at succession planning in light of climate change. And so really, the first thing is acknowledging that climate change exists and how that impacts your organization. So that's where, sort of where we are right now. Looking at species selection for plants that may be of less risk moving forward. Developing partnerships, because we cannot do all this by ourselves. And we have a lot of collecting partners that we work with, so a lot of that is in place. And then sort of, adapt a management strategy and start to move forward with that. And this is something that, goes on moving forward. So in the science division, we have, within the conservation strategic pillar, we've added a goal to lead the climate resiliency of our landscape through modeling, collaboration, research, and action. So essentially what this is advising people to do, this is really one of the essential goal moving forward. And how are we going to achieve this? I don't expect you to read all this, but essentially our science strategic plan has a series of phases, and within each of those phases a series of goals. So we're really looking moving forward to develop some of the baseline information within the next 6 months or so. Ultimately, our goal within the next 2 years is to develop a climate change adaptation plan. So really set up a plan of how we're going to do this moving forward. So again, this hasn't been happening in a vacuum. Over the last 10 years or so, Peter's done a lot of plant collecting around the world. I mentioned Quercus falcata, but there were a series of expeditions to the Caucasus Mountains. And so we have things in the pipeline like Zelkova carpinifolia, Ostraya carpinifolia, plants that really probably have really good climate resilience and would be great additions to our landscapes. And then, so historically, we've sort of focused our collecting, at least for hardy temperate plants, in a relatively narrow band around the globe. And so there's some modeling in place, and we're going to be delving into this deeper to look at what other places, moving forward, are suitable for us to explore. So this is a really interesting website out of University of Maryland. And essentially, you can plug in where you are today. So I plugged in Wilmington, Delaware. It will tell you under both the medium and harsh scenarios where your climate will be in 60 years. So this is essentially southeast Arkansas, southwest Arkansas, northeast Texas. And it also gives you this, rather than just a point on a map, it gives you these really wonderful sort of heat maps. So the redder is places that will be more similar, that currently have climates that will be more similar to what our climate will be in 60 years. And then yellow and blue is less similar. You can zoom out and look around the world as well. So you can look at, where in China currently has a climate that will be like our predicted climate, where in Japan, where in the Himalayas even. So it's a really useful tool to start to think about where we need to explore. And the other thing we can do is if you think about that map I showed you of Quercus falcata, Quercus falcata pretty much has a range pretty much like the red in here. So currently we can pick where that species reaches its northern limit, and with the thinking that there's a lot of plasticity in that species. So one of my goals is to start to overlay some species maps with this map and start to look at target areas where we can go over the next 5-10 years. All right, well, thanks everybody.